Snow falls on Bear Hollow like the mountain, has already decided what this winter will cost, and it has decided. It decided the moment a woman climbed this trail alone in the dark, carrying a rifle and a name that wasn't hers, and a past she'd buried under 400 miles of frozen ground. It decided the moment a man who hadn't spoken in 10 months heard her footsteps cross the cabin floor above him and didn't run. The territory of Montana in the winter of 1883 was not a place that forgave hesitation. It was not a place that offered second chances or soft landings, or any of the small mercies that people in warmer climates took for granted. It was a place where the things you carried eventually caught up with you, and the only question worth asking was whether you'd built something worth defending before they did. Snow falls red before the sun comes up on Bear Hollow, not from the sky. From the man bleeding into it, 30 yards below the trail's first switchback, one hand pressed against his side and the other counting down on his fingers in the gray pre-dawn dark. 5, 4, 3. A woman is already moving before he reaches 2, already has her rifle up, already knows the angle. And somewhere behind her in the trees, a man who hasn't made a sound in 10 months opens his mouth, not to scream, not to run, to say a name, one name, the only one that matters at that particular moment on that particular mountain. That morning is still 6 weeks away, but the woman climbing toward it doesn't know that yet. She just knows she's climbing. December 3rd, 1883. The trail up Bear Hollow began at the north edge of Coldstone, Montana territory, and lied to you for the first 20 minutes. Gentle grade. Wide enough for 2 horses. Pine branches overhead catching the snow before it reached the path, making it feel almost manageable. Almost like something a person could do in the dark in December without it costing them anything significant. Then the switchbacks started and the lying stopped. Maren Cole had been climbing for 3 hours when the trail pitched steep enough that she stopped thinking about what was behind her and started thinking exclusively about what was directly in front of her boots, which was the point maybe. The mountain had a way of narrowing your attention to the only problem that currently mattered. Walter Ashby was 6 months and 400 miles behind her. The warrant with her description on it was circulating through every territorial office between Colorado and the Canadian border. The bounty his family had posted was $5,000, which was the kind of number that turned patient men into persistent ones. None of that was relevant on this particular section of trail at this particular moment. What was relevant was the ice patch hidden under 6 inches of fresh powder that her left boot found without warning, and the half-second of pure animal terror when the mountain stopped being a metaphor and started being a thing that could kill her before anything else got the chance. She threw herself sideways, caught a pine with both arms, hung there while the rifle on her back swung hard against her spine and her lungs remembered that cold air at elevation had opinions about being inhaled quickly. Below her, through the gap in the trees where the trail's edge gave way to dark, she couldn't see the bottom. Didn't need to. She pulled herself back to solid ground, one handhold at a time. Her gloves tore on the bark. The cold found the gaps immediately, the way cold found every gap eventually, methodically, without urgency, because the cold had time and she didn't. When she stood again on flat rock, she didn't stop to examine her hands, checked the rifle, kept moving. Here was what she knew about the man she was climbing toward. His name was Boone Calloway. He'd lived alone on Bear Hollow for 3 years. He'd placed an advertisement in a Bozeman newspaper that read, in its entirety, "Wanted, bride for frontier homesteader. Remote location, hard work required, marriage of convenience." 26 women had responded before her. None of them had lasted longer than 9 days. The stories about why varied depending on who was telling them and how much they'd had to drink. But the consistent thread wasn't the man. It was something else in that cabin. Something the stories couldn't quite name directly, which meant whatever it was, people understood it was complicated and preferred the simpler version. She'd sent a telegram from Casper using a borrowed name, received money for travel within the week and one line of response, "Arrive when ready." Trail begins north edge of town. Remote meant invisible. Hard work meant no one expected performance. Marriage of convenience meant no questions she couldn't answer. And a man so notorious that 24 women had fled his mountain in documented succession meant no bounty hunter would think to look for a fugitive bride in a place the stories had already painted as cursed. She'd read the advertisement 3 times, then sent the telegram. The cabin appeared in the way things appeared at altitude, after sufficient hours of climbing, suddenly and without transition, as though the mountain had been withholding it until she'd proven she intended to arrive. It sat inside a clearing carved from the surrounding pines, massive and dark against the snow's pale backdrop. Thick timber walls, small windows cut more like rifle ports than anything designed to admit light or welcome visitors. A chimney rising into the night sky with no smoke curling from it, which meant either the fire had been banked recently or nobody was home. And the door opening before she reached it answered that question. He filled the frame the way a load-bearing wall filled a room. Not tall the way some men were tall, angular and apologetic about the space they occupied. Tall the way something structural was tall, removal inadvisable. He stood backlit by a single lantern somewhere deeper in the cabin, and for one suspended moment she couldn't resolve him into specific details, only mass and stillness, the particular stillness of someone who'd learned that waiting was more reliable than moving. When you didn't know what was coming at you. She stopped 20 feet out, old habit. She checked left, then right, then the man in the doorway, the same sequence she'd used every time she'd entered a new space for the last 6 months. The sequence that had kept her alive and was probably going to keep her alive for the foreseeable future, regardless of whether it looked strange to anyone watching. He let her run through it without comment. Then the lantern light caught his face properly, and she could see the rest of it. The scars distributed across angles that had already been hard before the scars got there. Dark hair past his collar, the length of a man who cut it himself when it became inconvenient and not before. A jaw that looked like it had been involved in a sustained disagreement with something solid and had declined to concede the point. Eyes carrying more accumulated watchfulness than most men his age came by honestly. The eyes of someone who'd been paying attention for a long time in places where inattention had a direct cost. He looked at her the way you looked at something you hadn't set yourself that you weren't yet sure was a trap. You're early. The words came rough, not unfriendly exactly. More like something stored too long without use, the mechanism still functional but the surface worn. Plans changed. He studied her, the rifle across her back, the pack on her shoulders. What the condition of both said about the last 3 hours of her life. You came up that trail tonight, not a question. He was reading the evidence the same way she read rooms. I did, alone, evidently. Something moved at the edge of his expression. The preliminary condition of something before it decided whether to become anything. He stepped back from the door. She walked forward, and the doorway was wide enough for one person centered or 2 people if one of them was willing to turn sideways. And he was large enough that she had to turn slightly, and her shoulder grazed his chest for one brief second of contact. She felt him tense at it. The specific tension of a man unaccustomed to people approaching at that distance, without visible fear written across every available surface of their body. She filed the information, kept moving. Inside told its own story. One large main room. A fireplace substantial enough to have architectural opinions about heat. Heavy furniture built by someone with patience and no apparent interest in ornamentation. The walls were bare timber with 2 exceptions. Elk antlers near the door and a bear skin covering part of the north wall. Both the trophies of a man who used what the mountain offered and wasted nothing. The space was clean. Not cleaned recently for a visitor. Clean the way a place was clean when the person living in it had decided some time ago that disorder was a form of inefficiency they couldn't afford. This didn't match the stories she'd heard in Coldstone. The stories had built something different. Something closer to chaos and menace. She'd spent an hour at the mercantile buying supplies before starting the climb, and the man behind the counter had tracked her purchases with the focused attention of someone who already knew the outcome and was observing the process as a formality. 3 boxes of ammunition, field medical supplies, dried meat and matches and a whetstone. The counterman had said, "Ma'am, are you certain about these items?" Most ladies arriving for Mr. Calloway tend toward more domestic goods, and she'd said how much, and he'd calculated, and she'd paid exact change and walked out while he was still constructing his next sentence. The door closed behind her with a sound that was simply final, not threatening. Just final the way real things were final. She set her pack down, released the rifle, turned to face him directly. The arrangement. She held his gaze the way she'd learned to hold things that required steadiness. You wrote marriage of convenience. 1 month trial before either side commits further. That's what I agreed to. That's what you agreed to. I'm not here to perform a proper wife. I don't do gentle for its own sake. I don't soften things that don't need softening. I hunt, I cook, I work, I carry my weight. But I'm not going to become a version of myself that the territory finds more comfortable. He was watching her with the same gumkukla of attention he'd used at the door, measuring something she couldn't fully name yet. You didn't ask about the arrangement from my side. I'm asking now. He moved to the fireplace, stirred the coals back to something useful. His back was to her, which was either indifference or trust, and she hadn't spent enough time in this space yet to know which category he operated from. Winter work up here isn't soft. Trapping, hunting, fence maintenance when conditions allow. Cellar inventory before January. 2 rifles in this room, both loaded, and I expect whoever lives under this roof to know how to use what's in them. I know how to use them. He turned, looked at her. Better than most men you've encountered in your life, she said. Not a performance. A fact she was offering the same way you offered information about the weather. Accurate and without decoration. Something in his face confirmed a calculation he'd already been running. There's one more thing. He said it quietly. 4 words that changed the air in the room, the way a barometric drop changed the air before a storm. Some shift in pressure that the body registered before the mind caught up. He moved to the side door, heavier than the front, reinforced in a way that was deliberate rather than incidental, and opened it. Cold came through, and from somewhere beyond the rectangle of dark, a barn, a lamp in a small window, the suggestion of something inhabited. His name is Elias Pruitt. He's 28 years old. He came back from the war, without whatever it is that lets a man talk to people afterward. I found him sitting in the ashes of his family's homestead 10 months ago, north of here. Family was gone. Place had burned. He was the only one still breathing. Calloway held the door but didn't gesture toward it. I brought him here because there was nowhere else. Maren looked at the lamp in the barn window. Something focused behind it, present. He doesn't speak. Not a word in 10 months. Comes inside when he decides to. Doesn't trust strangers, especially women. Calloway paused with the specific pause of a man deciding whether to say the last piece or let her discover it. He decided to say it. That's why they left. Not me, not this mountain. They couldn't manage being in a house with a man who looked through them, like they weren't there. Frightened them, or frustrated them, or both. Usually by the 3rd day, she looked at the barn window for a moment longer, then back at Calloway. What happened to his family? His jaw tightened, not evasion. The tightening of a man running a specific memory through the mechanism of deciding how much of it to hand to a stranger, made to look like a raid. Wasn't. Whoever did it knew exactly where to hit and exactly when. He paused. Elias was the only one who walked away from it. Barely. She thought about the difference between walking away from something and surviving it. The two weren't the same. She knew that with the specific knowledge of a person who'd done one, and was still working on the other. You thought a bride could reach him, she said. Where you couldn't. Thought a woman might be able to give him something I don't know how to give. He said it without embarrassment. The flat honesty of a man who'd already spent 10 months finding the edges of his own limitations. I'm not good with people, never was. After my wife died, I got considerably worse at it. He stopped. Not like he'd said too much. Like he'd said exactly enough and didn't want the words diluted by anything additional. There it was. Not an explanation. A coordinate. The location of something important that she now knew existed without knowing its full shape. A man who'd built 3 years of isolation around a specific loss and had been living inside that architecture so long he'd forgotten. It was a response to something rather than simply the way things were. She understood that kind of forgetting. Had done her own version of it in Colorado. Had lived inside Walter's version of her for so long that she'd needed a kitchen floor and a horn-handled knife to remember that the original version still existed somewhere underneath it. I'm not here to fix anything, she said. Or anyone. I'm here because I need to disappear and you need someone who won't run at the first sign of difficulty. That's the transaction between us. That's the transaction. Then we understand each other. She picked up her pack. Where do I sleep? He pointed to the ladder in the corner. She climbed it without looking back. The loft above was spare and deliberate. Straw mattress, wool blankets in a trunk, a shelf along one wall, a window cut small and high showing her nothing but dark and the white of continuing snow. She lay down fully dressed with the rifle within reach, and listened to the cabin accommodate her weight inside its walls. Below, Calloway moved to the fireplace, the scrape of the poker, the creak of his chair taking him, after a while, from outside, through the wall, the barn door, the specific compression of snow under a careful step. Then quiet replaced by a different quality of quiet, the quality of someone standing still and deciding something. She had lived for 2 years in a house where she'd learned to read the difference between sounds that were safe and sounds that required response. Not because Walter had been subtle, because survival required that kind of granular attention, and she'd developed it the way you developed any skill under sufficient pressure. The sound outside wasn't a threat. It was someone standing in the cold in the dark, assessing whether the cabin with the new person in it was still safe enough to sleep near. After a while, the footsteps retreated, back toward the barn. She lay there and didn't think about Walter. She thought about the advertisement, about the 3 lines that had looked like warning to everyone else, and looked like a map to her, about the specific kind of hiding that worked, not disappearing entirely, which was impossible, but disappearing into something visible, enough that nobody thought to look harder. A mountain, a notorious man, a domestic arrangement that made perfect sense to everyone watching and required no further investigation. She thought about Elias Pruitt standing somewhere in that barn in the dark, and what it meant to come back from the kind of thing that took your words away. Then she stopped thinking about anything at all and slept, not the shallow surveillance sleep of the last 6 months, one ear always open, body never fully releasing into rest, something closer to actual sleep, not because she was safe. She wasn't sure she'd ever be entirely safe again, but because the specific danger she'd been running from was 400 miles away, and the specific danger she'd be running from next hadn't fully materialized yet. And in the gap between those 2 things there was, briefly, enough room to breathe. She woke before dawn, to the sound of Calloway at the fireplace below, the poker, new wood, the front door opening briefly to the cold and then closing. She lay still and listened to him move through the kitchen sequence, the pan, the fat, the particular clank of the coffee pot on the iron stove, and understood without being told that this was what mornings looked like in this place. No announcement, no performance, just the work of keeping things going. She came down. He didn't look up when she descended. She didn't require him to. She found a mug on the shelf where mugs logically lived and poured coffee, and stood with her back to the wall facing the room, and he cooked without comment, and they ate when the food was ready, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence between them with anything it didn't already contain. "Barn's 40 yards behind the cabin," he said eventually, not looking up from the map spread across one end of the table, waited at the corner by his coffee mug. "He heard you come in last night. He'll know you stayed. How does he know? He knows when people leave. Tracks the door. 10 months on this mountain, he knows its sounds the way you know your own breathing." He moved his finger along something on the map. "He'll be watching from the barn. Not coming in, not today. He needs more than one morning before he decides whether a stranger is a problem." She looked at the side door. What changed after the other women left? A pause with weight in it. After the 3rd one, Calloway said, he stopped coming in for meals entirely, went back to eating in the barn. "I started leaving food out at the barn door at night." He set his mug down. "Took me 2 weeks to understand that every time someone left, it cost him something, and that he'd started doing the arithmetic before they'd even unpacked, figuring out how much it was going to cost him before he committed to hoping." She thought about that arithmetic, the specific calculation of a person who'd learned that the cost of being wrong about someone was higher than the cost of never finding out if you were right. She knew that calculation, had run it herself in Colorado in the 1st year, before the 2nd year made it irrelevant because the cost of staying had become the only number that mattered. After breakfast, she did the thing that needed doing, which was understand the space she was now living in. She came from the wall and moved through the room properly for the first time, checking exits, checking the weapons, checking the supplies, with the deliberate attention of someone who wasn't inspecting out of curiosity, but out of the practical necessity of knowing what she had available and in what quantity. Front door, heavy timber, interior bar, functional. Front window shuttered, solid latch. Side door to the barn, heavier than the front, double barred, built by someone who'd thought about what they were keeping out rather than what they were keeping in. No rear window on the ground floor. The loft window above, small, high, workable as an emergency exit for someone willing to drop 10 feet and run. Both rifles in good condition. Maintained regularly. Loaded. The angle of the mount above the mantel guaranteed a clean draw from either the kitchen area or the fireplace position, which meant whoever had put it there had thought about lines of sight in this room, not paranoia. Preparation. The distinction mattered. Supplies 3 months minimum, more if rationed carefully. Medical kit in the wooden box, the serious kind with needle and thread already threaded, which was the detail that told her the most. You pre-threaded your needle when you expected to need it in a hurry, possibly in the dark, possibly with hands that weren't entirely steady. Whoever had stocked that box had thought carefully about the conditions under which it would be used. She was finishing the ammunition count when she heard the back step. 1 footfall, then stillness. She kept counting. Not because she was performing calm, because she actually was calm, in the specific way she'd learned to be calm in Colorado, during the long quiet stretches between Walter's rages, when the surface of things was smooth and the water below was not. But you learned to inhabit the surface fully because it was the only inhabitable space available. She'd gotten very good at full presence inside partial safety. The footfall didn't repeat. But the quality of the quiet changed, the way it changed when the quiet had someone in it, rather than being simply empty. She finished counting, replaced the ammunition on the shelf, picked up the coffee pot, and poured the last of the morning's coffee into her mug, and went to stand at the window, which put her back to wherever he was standing and gave him the room to be in it, without being observed. Behind her, breathing, controlled, not afraid exactly. More the breathing of someone who'd trained themselves to occupy very little space in the world, to make minimal claims on the air around them, to exist at a volume low enough that whatever dangerous thing was in the room with them would have no reason to take notice. She recognized it, the way you recognized something you'd done yourself. "I'm not going to try making friends with you," she said, to the window, to the view it offered, which was the clearing and the pine trees beyond it and the gray of a December morning, deciding what kind of day it was going to be. "I'm not going to ask you questions or try getting you comfortable. I'm just going to be here doing what needs doing. And you can decide what to do with that on your own time." Nothing. "Coffee's almost out," she added. Because it was true and because true things stated plainly were their own kind of language, one that didn't require anything back. A very long pause. Then footsteps retreating. Not fast. The measured retreat of a man who'd heard what he came to hear and was going somewhere to think about it at his own pace and in his own time. The barn door. The hinges that needed oil. Then the particular silence that followed. She looked at the window for a moment longer, then went back to work. Walt Duggan arrived 4 days later on a mule with opinions about the grade, and arrived himself with news that couldn't wait for better weather. 70 years old and sharp as a man of 40, he came in off the trail with ice in his eyebrows, and the expression of someone carrying information that had weight to it. He accepted coffee with both hands and the specific gratitude of a man who'd earned the right to receive things graciously. "You're the new one." He looked at Maren without appraisal, just cataloging. The look of a man who'd processed enough information about enough people that he'd stopped wasting the energy of judgment on first meetings. "Maren Cole. Walt Duggan, feed store in Coldstone." He drank. "You climbed that trail alone at night in December." "I did." "Reason." "I had limited options." He held her gaze for one moment, filed something, moved on. He looked at Calloway. "There's something you need to hear." "Reason I came up in this instead of waiting for the thaw to break." He reached into his coat, produced a folded paper, set it flat on the table between them. "Man came into Coldstone 3 days ago asking questions. Name of Harlan Grace. You know that name." It wasn't a question. He was watching Calloway's face for the answer, and Calloway's face gave it immediately in the way of a man who hadn't been expecting the name, but recognized it. He's presenting himself as an associate of the Pruitt family, concerned about the management of the estate. Says Elias is the sole surviving heir and isn't currently in a position, those were his exact words, to manage his own affairs. Walt tapped the folded paper. "He's got paperwork that looks official enough that Judge McAllister agreed to give it a hearing. Guardianship claim on Elias, which would give Grace legal authority over whatever property Elias stands to inherit." Maren looked at the paper, then at Calloway, then at the side door. "What property?" she said. Pruitt Homestead sat on 160 acres of lower valley ground, Walt said. Continental Mining has been trying to acquire that parcel for 6 years. Thomas Pruitt turned them down every time. 4 offers, each one larger than the last, and he said no to all of them. He paused. The pause of a man about to say the part that mattered most. The homestead burned 8 days after Continental Mining's most recent offer was rejected. The pieces assembled themselves without requiring instruction. She said it quietly, because saying it out loud was its own weight regardless of how clearly you'd already seen it. Grace arranged the raid. That's the shape of it, Walt said. Can't prove it. Couldn't prove it then. But I've lived in Coldstone long enough to know convenient timing when I stand next to it. And I've been watching Grace's name circle back to this territory for 3 years. He looked at Calloway directly. He sold the adjacent parcel to Continental Mining himself, 7 weeks after the fire. Through a transaction nobody in town can fully account for. Calloway had gone to the window, not looking out at the trail, looking toward the barn without appearing to look at the barn, which was a different thing. He knows Elias is alive, Calloway said. He knows Elias survived. Whether he knows where Elias is specifically, I can't tell you with certainty. Walt folded the paper back into his coat. But a man like Grace doesn't leave a question he can answer with effort. The fire, the cold at the window's edges, the lamp in the barn's small window holding its steady light. He's going to come here, Maren said. Neither man corrected her. Then we need to know before he does, she said, not after. Calloway turned from the window. Something in his face had moved into a different register. The face of a man who'd understood since the morning he brought Elias down from that burned valley, that eventually something like this was coming, and had privately hoped he was wrong about it, and was now required to accept that he hadn't been. Walt stayed through the afternoon. He named 2 men Grace had been seen talking to at the saloon. Dex Morrow, a bounty hunter operating on the edges of legitimate territorial authority, and a younger man who'd said nothing to anyone, which Walt had been alive long enough to understand as calculation rather than shyness. After Walt left, the cabin held a different quality of quiet, the kind that came after you'd been told the shape of what was coming, and couldn't yet see far enough ahead to know how it would end. Maren was at the supply shelf when the back door opened. No tentative footfall this time. A direct entry, the entry of someone who'd made a decision and was implementing it before the second thoughts could organize. She continued what she was doing, counted the remaining salt, made a note. Footsteps crossed the back half of the kitchen, stopped. She could hear him breathing. Not the careful minimal breathing of that first morning. Still controlled, but less contracted. Less of himself pulled in. She didn't turn, picked up the flour tin, checked the weight of it. We're going to need more coffee before January, she said. To the shelf. And salt. The salt's lower than it should be for this time of year. No response. She didn't need one. She set the flour tin down and turned with the deliberate, unhurried speed of someone who wasn't changing their tempo because of anything in the room, only because the task required turning. And she crossed to the table to pick up the list she'd been building. He was there, standing near the back wall where he could see both doors and the ladder simultaneously. You treat them with kindness. 28 years old and carrying what looked like considerably more than that in the set of his shoulders and the way his eyes moved through the room. Cataloging. Assessing. The habitual threat assessment of a man whose threat assessment had been operating continuously for 10 months because the one time he'd stopped it, everything he had was taken from him. She looked at him long enough to see him accurately, then looked at her list. If you think of anything we're short of, she said, there's paper on the shelf. She went back to the inventory. He stood there for long enough that she finished 2 full counts of the bean supply. Then he moved. Not toward the door, toward the shelf. He picked up the paper, looked at it, set it back down, walked to the back door and let himself out. She waited until the hinges sounded, exhaled once, went back to the beans. That evening Calloway came in from checking the north fence line and looked at the paper on the shelf without touching it. Looked at her. There's a word on here, he said. I see that. He put it back down. She didn't look at it until he'd moved away. Then she looked. 1 word. Written in a hand that hadn't held a pen in a long time but remembered the mechanics well enough to manage it. The letters deliberate, chosen like each one cost something, beans. She added it to the list. That night she lay in the loft and listened to the wind make its case against the walls, and thought about a man who'd had everything taken from him, and had been sitting in a barn for 10 months, waiting for something he couldn't name, not rescue. Something shorter than that. Some evidence that the world still contained people who would stay in a room without requiring anything from him that he wasn't ready to give. She thought about Calloway at the window, looking toward the barn without appearing to, doing that every day for 10 months. She thought about the word beans on a piece of paper, and she thought about Walt Duggan's folded paper, and the name Harlan Grace, and the 7 weeks between a fire and a land sale, and what that mathematics meant for all three of them on this mountain. When Grace finally decided he'd gathered enough information to act on. Below her, the fire burned low. Outside, the barn lamp held its light in the small window, steady and particular, the light of someone still awake and still watching and not yet ready to stop. She understood that. Completely. She closed her eyes and didn't count the exits. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't run the numbers on where the doors were and how long it would take her to reach them and what was on the other side. Not because the exits had stopped mattering. Because for the first time since Colorado, there was something on this side of them that mattered more. She couldn't have named it yet, didn't try to. Just let it be there, unnamed and present and enough. The storm came in 2 days early, which was Montana's way of reminding you that your plans were suggestions it hadn't agreed to honor. Maren was splitting firewood behind the cabin when the sky changed, not gradually. The way it did in the territories when weather meant business, one moment gray and manageable, next moment something darker moving in from the northwest with the specific urgency of a debt collector who'd already given you more time than you deserved. She split the last log, stacked it, carried 2 armloads inside before the first real wind hit the clearing hard enough to knock snow from the pine branches in curtains. Calloway came in from the north trail 40 minutes later, ice in his beard, 3 rabbits on his belt, reading the sky through the cabin window, with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. Weak, he said. Maybe more this time. Morrow can't ride in a week of that. No. He skinned the first rabbit with practiced efficiency, but he can spend a week in Cold Stone learning everything anyone will tell him, and people will tell him. They always do. Man buys enough drinks, asks questions the right way, fills in his pitcher piece. The knife worked along the carcass without hurry. He'll know about you before the trail clears. Question is how much. Maren looked at the window. The snow had gone from drifting to driving in the 20 minutes since she'd come inside. What does Cold Stone actually know about me? That you arrived on Curtis's coach? That you bought ammunition at the mercantile? That you climbed the trail the same night? He paused. Percy Denor's not a gossip by nature, but he keeps records, and Morrow has ways of making records feel like conversation. She thought about Percy's mercantile, the specific inventory she'd purchased, 3 kinds of ammunition, field medical supplies, nothing that read as Bride except in the most heavily edited version of the story. And Grace, she said. Grace is separate. Grace has his own timeline. Calloway set the second rabbit down. He wants the guardianship established through legal channels if he can manage it. Cleaner that way, harder to contest afterward. Is it legal? The paperwork looks legal. Whether it is depends on what a judge decides to examine closely. He finally looked at her directly. Elias has never been declared incapacitated by any court, never been evaluated. Grace's claim rests entirely on the argument that a man who doesn't speak can't manage his own affairs. The fire, the knife, the sound of the storm building its case against every seam in the timber. Elias can write, she said. Calloway stopped. He wrote beans on that list. She let it sit there between them. A man who can write his own name and communicate what he needs can legally manage his own affairs in any territory court I've heard of. The incapacity argument falls apart if Elias is willing to demonstrate otherwise. Silence for 3 full seconds. He'd have to appear, Calloway said, careful. Like a man testing ice before committing his weight to it. In front of people. In Cold Stone. Eventually, yes. He hasn't been in Cold Stone since I brought him up here. I know. He doesn't like open ground. Doesn't like crowds. Doesn't like being in spaces where he can't see the exit from where he's standing. He set the knife down. Both hands flat on the table. That's not stubbornness. That's what the war put in him, and it's not coming out by asking nicely. I'm not asking nicely yet. She picked up the list from the shelf, the one word on it. I'm saying the option exists. What we do with it depends on what Elias is willing to do. And that depends on things we can't know yet. She looked at him. But I needed you to understand that it exists. He looked at the list for a long moment. Yeah, he said, heavy. The word carrying more than its single syllable. I understand. The storm locked them in for 6 days. 6 days of a kind of proximity that didn't ask for permission and didn't offer warning. She learned the cabin's winter rhythm from the inside, in a way the first week hadn't allowed. Calloway rose before dawn regardless of weather, fed the fire, checked the perimeter himself when Elias didn't, which was rare, maybe twice in 6 days. And both times he did it without comment when he returned. Cooked breakfast with the same economical precision she'd catalogued from the first morning. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. And Elias came inside on the second morning of the storm, and didn't go back to the barn until the 5th, not all at once, not with announcement. He came in for breakfast on the second day and didn't leave when the meal was done. Sat in the corner nearest the back wall where he could see the front door and the back door simultaneously. Didn't speak, didn't participate in the sparse conversation between Maren and Calloway about firewood quantities and whether the north fence section would need attention before spring, but he stayed. Maren treated this the same way she'd treated every other thing he'd done since she arrived. Accurately and without decoration, he was in the room. He wasn't a problem. She had work to do in the room. She did the work. On the third day, she was cleaning her rifle at the table and felt his attention shift. Not toward her exactly, toward the rifle. The specific quality of attention a person gave to a thing they understood and hadn't been near in a long time. You carried one. Not a question. She could tell by the way his shoulders had changed position. What kind? Nothing. Springfield, probably. Most infantry. She ran the cleaning rod through the barrel. This one's a Winchester. 73. Action's cleaner, but the Springfield throws heavier. Different feel in a sustained engagement. She set the cleaning rod down, picked up the oilcloth, worked it along the receiver with measured strokes, and she felt him lean forward, just fractionally, the way a man leaned when something pulled at attention he'd been trying to keep reined in. You can look at it, she said. It's not loaded. A pause that lasted long enough for her to complete 2 full strokes of the cloth. Then he stood, crossed the room, stopped at the table's edge, looked down at the rifle with an expression she could read even from the side. Recognition. The complicated recognition of something familiar that had also been part of the worst experience of your life. She set the cloth down and slid the rifle an inch toward him on the table. Not the whole way, an inch. An offer he could decline by not moving his hands. He picked it up, checked the chamber first. Automatic. The reflex of a trained man confirming what he'd been told rather than taking the information on faith, which was exactly right. Empty. He settled the stock against his shoulder, looked down the barrel toward the front wall. His hands were absolutely steady. Maren watched this and understood something that hadn't been fully visible before. The war hadn't broken Elias Pruitt's ability to function. It had broken his ability to want to, which was a different problem with a different set of possible solutions, none of them available on a specific timeline. He set the rifle back on the table with the particular care of a man returning something borrowed. Looked at her for one moment with eyes that were exactly as sharp as she'd suspected from the beginning. Then he went back to his corner. Calloway, from his chair by the fire, had not looked up from the harness he was repairing during this entire exchange. But when she glanced at him, his hands had stopped moving on the leather. He resumed 2 seconds later. Said nothing. On the 4th evening, she was telling the window about the structural inadequacy of its latch again. A habit by now. A way of filling the room with sound that didn't require anything from anyone in it. She'd moved from the latch to the general philosophy of frontier construction, which had some merit she was willing to acknowledge, and several decisions she found genuinely puzzling when she heard it again. From the corner. A sound so brief and so quickly swallowed that she almost didn't trust it. Almost. She kept going. Told the window that whoever had decided this particular overhang angle was adequate for a Montana winter had clearly never spent a Montana winter. The sound came again. Still brief, still immediately suppressed. But this time she caught the shape of it more clearly. Not amusement at the window. At her. Specifically. At the fact that she was having this conversation with a piece of woodwork and conducting herself as though the woodwork had standing in the dispute. She turned, very slowly, and looked at him directly for the first time during one of these moments. He had his face turned partly away. But the corner of his mouth was doing something it clearly hadn't done in a long time, and wasn't entirely sure how to manage. The latch is a genuine problem, she said. He looked at the floor, I'm not wrong about the overhang either. He pressed his lips together. She could see the effort of it. She turned back to the window, gave him the privacy of not watching, kept talking, told the window that the overhang situation was going to be someone's problem before April, and that person was going to wish someone had listened to her assessment when it was still theoretical. From the corner came a sound she hadn't heard in this cabin in 10 months. A full breath, released. The way a laugh released when you'd been holding it long enough that it stopped asking for permission. Calloway set the harness down, looked at her with an expression she was going to file away, because it was the first time she'd seen his face do something completely without defense. She went back to the window latch. On the 5th day, the storm showed its first sign of relenting. Not clearing, just shifting from sustained assault to considered commentary. Calloway went outside to assess the roof load and came back with snow in his hair, and a report that the main trail was impassable but the lower meadow trail was close. Day, he said. Day and a half before Morrow can ride it. Maren looked at Elias in his corner. He was watching Calloway with the focused attention he brought to any new piece of information about what was coming for them. He knows, she said quietly to Calloway, not trying to make it private because there was no privacy in a single room and Elias had the best ears in the building. He's been in here 5 days. He's heard everything. Calloway looked at Elias directly, held it. You understand what Grace is doing, he said. Flat, direct. Not softened into palatability. He wants the land. The guardianship is how he gets access to your father's estate without anyone being able to contest it legally once it's established. If a court declares you incapacitated, everything your father owned goes to Grace as managing trustee. Elias's expression didn't change, but his hands, resting on his knees, pressed down once. The specific pressure of a man taking a physical grip on something because what was in front of him was too large to hold in his head all at once. There's a way to stop it, Maren said. She sat down across from him, same as she'd sit at any table with any person, not crouching to his level like he was diminished, not standing over him like she was explaining, just across from him, equal plane. You'd have to appear in front of Judge McAllister in Coldstone, demonstrate that you are competent to manage your own affairs. Which you are, completely. He looked at her. You don't have to speak, she said. Written answers would establish the same legal point. You write, you answer questions, you prove that your mind works and that you never needed anyone's guardianship. She paused. Grace's entire case disappears the moment a judge sees you functioning. The longest silence yet in that corner. Then Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper she hadn't seen before, held it out toward her. She took it, unfolded it. A list, written in that same careful hand that had given her the word beans 6 days ago. Not one word this time. 20 items on the supply shelf they were running low on. The specific measurements of the gap in the north fence section that would need repair. And at the bottom, in slightly larger letters as though to distinguish it from the rest, Grace sold the land to Continental Mining. I know what he paid. My father kept records. Her chest tightened, not with grief, with the particular weight of a man handing over the heaviest thing he owned because he'd decided you were worth the cost. She looked up at him. His eyes were steady, clear. The eyes of a man who'd been waiting inside his own silence for someone to demonstrate they could carry something real before he handed them anything that mattered. Where are the records, she said. He took the paper back, wrote one more word on the bottom of the list. Barn. Calloway moved to the back door without being asked. The records were in a waterproof oilskin pouch sewn into the lining of a saddlebag Elias had carried out of the burning homestead. They spread across the kitchen table in the last hour of stormlight and told a story that was both more specific and more damning than Walt Duggan had suspected. Thomas Pruitt had documented every communication with Continental Mining over 6 years, every offer, every refusal, every name. And in the final entry, dated 3 weeks before the fire, a meeting he'd had with Harlan Grace, who had presented himself as an independent broker and had made an offer that exceeded Continental Mining's previous best by 40%. Thomas Pruitt had written 4 sentences about it. The last one read, I do not trust this man's money or his motives, and I told him so directly. He smiled when I said it. That is not how an honest man responds to being told no. Maren read it twice, looked at Calloway, looked at Elias. This goes in front of McAllister, she said. All of it. Elias nodded once. You'll have to be there. Another nod, slower, the weight of it visible in the set of his shoulders. But definite. The decision already made, and this was just the confirmation. "We'll be there with you," Calloway said, his voice rough with something he didn't elaborate on and didn't need to. The storm finished its business the following morning and departed without apology. Morrow arrived before noon. She heard the horses first, stopped what she was doing in the kitchen, counted the hoofbeats the way you counted things when the count mattered. 3 animals, moving up the main trail with a pace that wasn't cautious, the pace of men who'd decided on their terms in advance and were arriving to implement them. Calloway was in the main room. He heard it too. Their eyes met, a full exchange in 2 seconds. She moved the rifle from the mantel to the table, set it at her right hand, stood with her back to the fireplace so she could see the door and the window simultaneously. Elias was in the barn. She'd sent him there an hour ago, not because she expected this specifically, but because she'd been expecting something all morning, the way you expected things when the weather cleared after a week of preparation. 3 knocks. Deliberate spacing. Authority performed. Calloway went to the door. Dex Morrow was built lean and long, the physique of a man who'd been in motion most of his life and never accumulated anything that slowed him down. He stood in the doorway with his hat on, and his eyes already in the room past Calloway's shoulder, doing inventory. The 2 men behind him stayed mounted, hands visible, relaxed in the specific way of men who'd learned that looking relaxed was a tactical advantage. Calloway. Morrow's voice had the texture of a man who'd practiced being pleasant without being warm. "Heard you finally found one that stuck. Congratulations." Calloway stepped back from the door. Not an invitation, a position shift. Morrow entered. His eyes found her immediately, tracked to the rifle on the table, tracked back to her face. And she watched him adjust something internally, a small recalculation, the kind that happened when a situation contained an element you hadn't fully accounted for. "Mrs. Calloway." He touched the brim of his hat, the gesture of a man who'd learned manners the same way he'd learned everything else. By observing what opened doors, Mr. Morrow, she kept her hands visible and near the table and said nothing else. Territorial business. He crossed to the center of the room, didn't sit, positioned himself where he could see both of them without moving his head. "There's a warrant circulating from Colorado. Woman matching your description. Goes by the name Hannah Ashby, though she's been using various alternatives since October." He produced a paper from his coat, held it out toward her without approaching closer. She didn't take it. "I'd have to see the warrant to know if it's valid," she said. "And I'd want to know who issued it before I gave it any weight." Territorial magistrate out of Denver. Issued on the complaint of the Ashby estate. His eyes hadn't moved from her face, reading her the way she was reading him, both of them conducting their evaluation in plain sight and neither pretending otherwise. "Charge is murder in the 1st degree. My name is Maren Cole." She held his gaze without effort. "I've been in Montana since September and in Bear Hollow since December 3rd. You're welcome to verify either of those facts with anyone in Coldstone." September. Morrow's pleasant expression adjusted by 3 degrees towards something more deliberate. "The warrant was filed in October. Then we agree on the timeline." She kept her voice level, not cold. "Level, which means the warrant doesn't describe my situation." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that was meant to create discomfort. It required a certain kind of target to work on, and she was not that target. "Mind if I look around?" He said it the way men said things that weren't questions. "I do mind." She didn't raise her voice, didn't move toward the rifle. The rifle was there. The situation would tell her if she needed it. "You're welcome to stand where you are and ask questions. You're not welcome to search this cabin without my husband present and without a signed order from a judge whose name I recognize." Morrow's mouth curved. Not warmth, appraisal. "You've dealt with territorial law before. I've dealt with men who used it as a costume before." She said it evenly. "There's a difference, and I know what it looks like." Behind Morrow, through the window, she could see the 2 mounted men exchanging a glance. Small. Involuntary. The glance of men recalibrating. "We'll come back," Morrow said, the curve of his mouth doing something that was not a smile regardless of its shape. "When your husband's available. Make everything proper." He touched his hat again, crossed back to the door, paused with one hand on the frame, and looked at the rafters above the main room in a way that was too deliberate to be casual. "Quiet place you've got here. Don't hear much out of it. Montana winters are quiet." She didn't look at where he was looking. Kept her eyes on him. "That's the appeal. He left. She held position until the hoofbeats descended below the point where she could track them individually. Then she moved to the window. Watched until the tree line closed behind them. Her hands had started shaking, not during now. The way they always started after rather than during, all the adrenaline waiting politely until the threat was gone to make its presence known. She pressed them flat against the table until the shaking ran its course. Calloway hadn't moved from his position near the fireplace. He was looking at her with an expression she was still learning to read, the one that contained more than one thing at once. "He's going back to Grace," she said. "Yes, they're going to put the two things together, my warrant and Grace's guardianship claim. Use one to validate the other. Make it look like you and I are operating some kind of arrangement to shelter a fugitive and a compromised heir simultaneously. That's the shape of it." He moved to the table, looked at the warrant Morrow had left on the edge without her touching it, which means McAllister is going to hear Grace's version first, with Morrow's endorsement. She thought about the records in the oilskin pouch, about Thomas Pruitt's 4 sentences and the final one about the smile. Then we need to be in front of McAllister before Grace is. She looked at Calloway, not after, before. He held her gaze for a moment. Then Walt Duggan knows McAllister's schedule. Send for him. He's 70 years old and the trail just cleared. He'll come, she said. He came in worse for less. Calloway went to the back door and walked to the barn. She watched through the window. He knocked twice. The door opened. She couldn't see Elias's face from this angle, but she could see Calloway's. And what was on it was not the expression of a man delivering news to someone fragile. It was the expression of a man talking to an equal about what came next. He came back 10 minutes later. Elias already knew Morrow had come up, heard the horses, stayed put, listened through the barn wall. He sat down at the table, looked at the map that had lived there for 3 days now. He wants to go to Coldstone. She looked up. His words. Calloway's jaw moved briefly. Not signed, spoken, 2 of them. Go. Coldstone. The first words in 10 months. She let herself feel that, all the way through, because some things deserve to be felt completely before you move to the next thing. Then she moved to the next thing. We need 3 days of preparation before we go down, she said. Gather everything from the oilskin. Get Walt up here to coordinate. Make sure we know what McAllister needs and in what order. She started writing on the paper that still had beans at the top of it. And I need to know everything about Cecily Ward. Calloway looked up. The woman in Coldstone asking about me. She'd been turning this over since Walt's note. You said a woman was asking questions. Who is she to the Ashby family? Walt, said sister. Walter Ashby's sister. Then she's not here for Grace. She kept writing. She's here for her own reasons. And her reasons might be different from what the family posted the reward for. Or she's working with Grace. Or that. She acknowledged it. But if she's not, she's a separate problem that could either destroy everything or hand us something we need, depending on what she's actually looking for. She set the pen down. I need to talk to her before she talks to anyone else. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Alone, she said, before we go to McAllister. Because if she's going to be a problem, I need to know the shape of it. And if she's not, I need to know that too. His jaw tightened. Not in objection. In the way it tightened when he was running through the same calculation she was, and arriving at the same answer, despite not liking either the question or the destination. When? Tomorrow, she said. Before Morrow has time to talk to Grace, and Grace has time to file anything with McAllister. That's a hard ride down and back. Everything up here is a hard ride. That's the appeal you told me. He looked at her. A long look, the kind that was trying to do several things simultaneously, and was managing all of them. I didn't say that. You said that. I was quoting the mountain. She picked up the pen again. Send for Walt tonight if the trail allows it. I'll leave for Coldstone at first light. He didn't argue. She was beginning to understand that this was how he operated. Not capitulation. Not agreement exactly. But the recognition of when someone else's read on a situation was the one worth acting on. He'd built his entire life around a specific variety of self-sufficiency. Trusted his own judgment because it was the only one available. And now he was learning, by increments, to widen the circle of what counted as available. She understood the difficulty of that, the particular effort of extending trust when you'd spent years building the architecture of not needing to. Walt arrived the following morning before she left, which was faster than she'd expected, and which told he'd been watching for exactly this kind of summons. He was breathing hard from the trail, but his eyes were sharp and he had news before his coat was off. Grace filed with McAllister yesterday afternoon. Walt accepted coffee in both hands. Guardianship papers formally submitted. McAllister's agreed to a hearing 4 days from today. He looked at Calloway, looked at Maren, looked at the paper on the table with its growing list of items. You're behind. Not yet. Maren picked up her coat. I need to know about Cecily Ward. Quiet woman. Staying at the boarding house, not the saloon. Asks questions, listens more than she talks. She's been here 4 days and she hasn't spoken to Grace or Morrow once, which is either coincidence or it means something. Maren put her coat on. She carries a notebook, Walt added. Small one, black cover. Writes in it after every conversation. She thought about that. A woman who wrote things down, who specifically avoided the men her family had presumably told to find the woman who'd killed her brother. She's not here to collect the reward, Maren said, not for anyone's benefit. Just the conclusion landing and needing to be said aloud. She went to the door. If Morrow comes back while I'm gone, she said without turning, keep him outside. Don't let him through the door. She looked at Calloway then, one direct look, the kind that carried more than a single sentence could hold. I'll be back before dark. His expression did the thing it sometimes did when she said something that landed somewhere specific in him. Not soft. Something beneath soft. Something a man accumulated when he'd been alone long enough that the presence of another person in the room started to register as something worth protecting rather than something worth managing. She left before either of them could say anything else that would make the leaving harder. The trail down was clear but treacherous in the specific way of things that had recently been buried and were now exposed, ice under a crust of fresh snow that offered no indication of what it was concealing until you'd already committed your weight to it. She took it at a pace the horse could manage without risking a foreleg. The mountain below her expanded into valley as she descended, cold stone appearing piece by piece between the trees, smoke from its chimneys hanging flat in the cold air because flat smoke meant more weather building somewhere west. More weather, which was fine. She'd worked in worse. She found Cecily Ward in the boarding house dining room. The only person there at that hour, a notebook open on the table and a pen in her hand, and an expression of the kind that belonged to people who were doing the math on something they didn't want the answer to. Dark hair pulled severely back. Clothing that was too fine for Coldstone in the way that meant she'd packed for a trip she hadn't anticipated, would include places like Coldstone. The face of a woman in her middle 30s who had been beautiful and still was, but wore it now the way you wore a coat you'd stopped noticing. Background. Functional. Not the point. She looked up when Maren sat down across from her without invitation. And something happened in her face that Maren had not been prepared for. Not recognition. Not alarm. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a woman who'd been holding a question for 10 years and was looking at the answer. Hannah, Cecily Ward said, her voice cracking on the single word with a grief that was not simple and not recent. My name is Maren Cole. I've been in Bear Hollow since December. Cecily closed the notebook, set the pen down with the deliberate care of someone putting a weapon on the table voluntarily. I'm not here to take you back. I need you to understand that before anything else. Then why are you here? The question sat between them in the cold dining room, with its smell of yesterday's coffee and wood smoke, and the particular staleness of a building that hadn't been warm enough all winter. Cecily looked at her hands on the table. Because I need to know what he was, she said finally, each word chosen like a step across uncertain ground. Not what the family said he was, not what the warrant says you did, what he actually was behind our door when no one else was looking. She looked up, because I already know the answer. I've known for 15 years, and I'm tired of being the only one in the family who knows it and stays quiet about it anyway. Maren looked at her for a long moment. Then she put both hands flat on the table between them, and she began to talk, not from the beginning, from the kitchen, from October, from the specific moment when the thing that had been building for 2 years finally arrived at its conclusion, and she'd had to choose between her life and his continued assumption that she didn't value it enough to defend it. Cecily Ward listened with the focused stillness of a woman who'd been waiting for this specific conversation to exist in the world. And her notebook stayed closed the entire time. Cecily Ward made her decision in the cold dining room of a cold stone boarding house. And then she sat with it long enough to make sure it was actually a decision, and not just a feeling wearing a decision's clothes. She looked at Maren across the table with eyes that had done a great deal of quiet, private work over a great many years and said, "I'm going to tell the family you're gone. That the trail went cold in Wyoming. That you probably didn't survive the winter." She paused. "They'll believe it because they want to. People believe convenient things when the alternative requires them to look at themselves." Maren held the look without offering anything easy back. "You'd be lying to your family for the rest of your life." "I've been lying to my family for 15 years. Cecily picked up the notebook, put it inside her coat. "The difference is now I'd be lying for a reason I can respect." She stood, smoothed her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady and didn't try to hide it. "One condition. Name it. Live like it cost me something." Her voice dropped into a register that didn't ask for sympathy and didn't need it, because it will. "Every Christmas, every time his name comes up at the table, every time my mother asks if anyone's heard anything." She held Maren's gaze for one long second. "Make it worth what I'm paying." Maren stood, reached across the table and took the other woman's hand for exactly the length of time it took to say something without words, then released it. "I intend to," she said. She rode back up the mountain in the flat gray light of a Montana afternoon that couldn't decide between threatening and delivering. The trail was worse going up than it had been coming down, the ice having softened just enough during the midday hours to be unpredictable, and she made the horse work carefully through 3 sections, where she'd have preferred to go faster and couldn't. The necessity of patience, when patience was the only available instrument. She arrived at the cabin as the light was going copper through the pines. Calloway was on the porch, which meant he'd been watching the trail long enough to know when a rider was approaching and had come outside rather than wait at the window. She filed that. Set it next to the other things she'd been filing across 3 months without a formal inventory. "Well," he said, "she's leaving." Maren dismounted, handed the reins off, let her legs remember what level ground felt like. "Coldstone by tomorrow morning, Colorado by the end of the week. She'll tell the family I'm gone." Pause in which he processed this. "You believe her?" "I believe she's been carrying the truth about her brother for 15 years. And it got heavy enough that telling it to one person who needed to hear it felt like setting something down." She looked at the barn. Lamp glow in the small window. "She's not coming back. And Morrow's problem is that Morrow works for Grace now. If the guardianship claim falls apart in front of McAllister, Morrow loses his reason to be in this territory." She moved past him toward the door. "One problem collapses the other if we do this correctly. That's a significant if. Most of the useful ones are." Inside, Elias was at the table, not in his corner. At the table with the oilskin records spread in front of him, organized into a sequence she hadn't arranged them in herself. He'd been through all of it, sorted by date. The earliest communications between Thomas Pruitt and Continental Mining at one end, the final entry about Harlan Grace at the other, and in the middle, a separate stack she hadn't seen before, smaller papers, different handwriting, older ink. She sat across from him, looked at the separate stack. He pushed it toward her. Letters. Between Thomas Pruitt and a man named Aldous Crane, identified in the salutation as the regional land supervisor for Continental Mining, dated across 4 years. Civil at first, increasingly less so. The final letter in the sequence was from Crane to Thomas Pruitt, and it was 3 paragraphs of language that was technically professional and actually threatening. The final line: "We will find a way to acquire this property, Mr. Pruitt, with your cooperation or without it." Delays of this nature only increased the eventual cost to all parties involved. 6 weeks later, the homestead burned. Maren set the letter down, looked at Elias. His jaw was working, not speaking, holding something back that was too large for the room and too long stored to come out cleanly even now. His eyes were on the letter, and the look in them was the specific look of a man who'd known a thing in his body for 10 months, and was now seeing it confirmed on paper, and the confirmation didn't help the way you hoped it would. "This goes to McAllister with everything else," she said. Steady, no attempt to soften it. He didn't need soft, he needed accurate. "Crane's letter plus your father's final entry about Grace plus the land transaction records. 3 separate threads. McAllister can't ignore all of them at once." Elias nodded. "Once. Contained. You'll have to be in that room," she said. "You already know that." Another nod, "and it's going to be full of people." She watched the thing that moved through it at the word people. Not fear exactly. The anticipation of something that required more from him than he was sure he had left. But you've been checking the perimeter of this clearing every morning for 10 months. Every morning. In the dark, alone. She held his gaze. You know how to move through something hard without knowing what's on the other side. You've been doing it every single day. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and wrote on the edge of the nearest paper, in that careful, deliberate hand. How many people? Coldstone's not a large town, she said. But word will have gotten out. I won't lie to you about that. It'll be the town hall. It'll be full. He looked at what he'd written, looked at the records on the table, looked at the final letter from Crane. Then he wrote one more line beneath the first. My father refused them 4 times. I can do this once. Calloway, behind her, made a sound that was not quite a word. She didn't turn to look at him. She knew what his was doing, and she needed him to have a moment with it that wasn't being watched. She started organizing the records back into the oilskin. Systematic. One document at a time. They had 3 days. The preparation was the kind of work that asked everything of you and acknowledged nothing in return. Walt Duggan came up the second morning with Percy Dunor from the Mercantile, a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers and the memory of a man who'd kept records his entire professional life, because he'd learned early that the territory ran on paper, and paper lasted longer than memory. Percy had his own ledger. Every transaction he'd recorded in Coldstone across 11 years, including the sale of the land adjacent to the Pruitt homestead to Continental Mining, which had been processed through a broker whose name appeared in Percy's records as H. Grace. I didn't put it together at the time, Percy said. He was a man who held himself responsible for things that weren't his fault in the way of people who valued accuracy over their own comfort. I recorded it as a standard land transaction. The name Grace didn't mean anything to me in this context until Walt explained the connection. It means something now, Maren said. That's what matters. Walt had arranged an appointment with McAllister for the morning of the hearing, not the hearing itself. The morning before. 1 hour with the judge in his private office to present the documentary record before Grace arrived with his version of events, and his lawyer and his 2 paid witnesses. McAllister's a fair man, Walt said. Not an easy one. He's going to want to know why this information is coming to him the day before, rather than the day the guardianship was filed. Because we didn't know Grace had filed until after he did it, Maren said, and because Elias Pruitt spent 10 months not speaking to anyone, which is why Grace thought the guardianship would go unopposed. She looked at Walt. McAllister's going to look at a man who was nonverbal for 10 months and is now in his office the day before a hearing. That's going to require explanation. Yes, Walt said simply. She looked at Elias across the table. He wrote, let me explain it. 3 words, on paper. But 3 words that contained an entire architecture of intention. She looked at Calloway. He looked at Elias. Something passed between them that had been building for 10 months without a specific shape and had found one just now. All right, Calloway said, his voice carrying the particular roughness it carried when he was holding something back that didn't need to be said aloud. We do it your way. The morning of the hearing, Maren was dressed before dawn, not in what she'd climbed the mountain in 3 months ago. Walt had arranged fabric from Percy's store, and she'd spent 2 evenings making something that would read correctly in a courtroom without performing a version of herself she wasn't. Dark wool, practical, cut, nothing that apologized for itself. She came downstairs to find Calloway at the table with his coat already on and his best hat on the table beside him, which she'd seen him wear exactly once before, the day he'd ridden to Coldstone for supplies in November and come back with information about Grace's arrival. He looked at her, and the look did the thing it sometimes did, contained more than one register simultaneously, and he didn't try to simplify it. You look like someone who's about to walk into a room and change what happens in it, he said. That's the plan. Elias came in from the barn. He'd been there since before she woke. She'd heard him moving through the pre-dawn dark in the familiar pattern, but he was dressed now in a way that was not his daily barn clothes. Cleaner lines. The coat brushed, his hat in his hands rather than on his head, which was its own kind of formality. He looked at both of them. Then he put his hat on and walked to the door, which was the clearest possible sentence. The ride down took an hour. 3 horses, 3 riders, the trail negotiable but cold, the valley expanding below them as they descended into a morning that was trying very hard to be clear and mostly succeeding. Coldstone emerged from the trees looking smaller than the weight it was about to carry, a single main street, a cluster of buildings, smoke from the bakery and the saloon and the boarding house chimneys, mixing into one gray column above the rooflines. More horses at the rail than a Tuesday morning warranted. More people on the street than the cold justified standing in. Word had traveled. It always traveled. A frontier town ran on news the way a mill ran on water, constantly, regardless of the hour, and the news of a contested guardianship hearing involving the burned Pruett homestead, and a mountain man who'd sheltered the sole survivor, and a new bride with a Colorado history that Morrow had been describing to anyone who'd hold still long enough. That was the kind of news that emptied the feed stores on a workday morning. Maren rode to the center of that attention without adjusting her posture or her pace. They met with McAllister first. His office smelled of pipe tobacco and decades of paper, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult decisions had been made, and the difficulty had settled into the walls. McAllister himself was 60 and looked 70, and had the eyes of a man who'd been surprised very few times in the last 30 years, and was braced against being surprised now. He looked at the records, all of them, the full sequence, the mining company letters, Thomas Pruett's entries, the land transaction records, the final note about Grace's smile. He read without comment. The clock on his wall made its points in the silence. Then he looked at Elias. Elias met the look. McAllister said, "The guardianship claim rests on the assertion of incapacity, inability to manage personal affairs. In your view, does that description apply to you?" Elias reached into his coat, pulled out the paper he'd written the night before, working by lantern light at the kitchen table for 2 hours, while Maren and Calloway pretended to be engaged in other things and watched him from the edges of their attention. He set it on McAllister's desk. The judge read it. It was 1 page, written in the careful, deliberate hand that had started with the word beans 6 days into a storm, and had been finding its range ever since. It described the night of the fire with the precision of a man who had organized the memory into language, slowly and privately over 10 months, because he'd had nothing else to do in the quiet of a barn on a Montana mountain, except remember and wait for a reason to say it. It named what he'd heard. It named the voice he'd recognized. It identified Harlan Grace by name as the man who had stood outside the burning house and given orders. And it ended with a single line that McAllister read twice, his expression doing something that judges weren't supposed to let their expressions do in professional contexts. "My father built that land for 40 years and refused to sell it for 6. I intend to hold it for the rest of my life. That is the only management decision that needs to be made about the Pruett estate today." McAllister set the paper down, looked at all 3 of them. "I'll hear the full proceeding as scheduled," he said, "but I want this documentation entered into the record before Grace's counsel arrives." He looked at Elias specifically. "And I want you in that room, present, visible. Whatever else happens today, the court needs to see the man whose incapacity is being claimed." Elias nodded once. His hands resting on his knees were steady. The town hall filled quickly. Maren had expected it, and still the actual fullness of it landed differently than the anticipation. Every chair taken. People standing along the walls, faces she recognized from Percy's descriptions. The blacksmith, the woman who ran the boarding house, 2 ranchers from the Valley Road, who had no direct stake in the outcome, but understood instinctively that what was decided here today would set a precedent for what the territory would tolerate from men like Grace. Harlan Grace sat at the petitioner's table with his lawyer and 2 witnesses, and the expression of a man who'd arrived confident and was in the process of revising that confidence without showing the revision. He'd seen the records enter the room with McAllister's clerk. He'd seen Elias Pruett sitting at the respondent's table, present, not the absent and incapacitated heir the guardianship claim required him to be. His lawyer leaned close. Grace listened, nodded. The performance of calm maintained by someone whose arithmetic was shifting under them and who couldn't let the shift show. Dex Morrow sat in the gallery, arms crossed, watching Maren with the expression of a man who'd run a calculation and kept getting an answer he didn't like. McAllister called the proceeding to order with an efficiency that told you he'd been doing this long enough to have strong views about the value of other people's time. Grace's lawyer presented first, the standard construction. Elias Pruett, sole heir to the Pruett estate, had been nonverbal and functionally withdrawn for 10 months, had been living under the care and shelter of a third party with no legal standing regarding the estate. was unable, in the petitioner's professional judgment, to manage the affairs of a significant landholding without guidance. The guardianship was presented as protection, as care, as the responsible stewardship of a family legacy by a man who had known the Pruitt family for years. Walt Duggan, from the second row, made a sound that was audible in the specific silence following the word years. McAllister did not acknowledge it, but the corner of his mouth moved. Then Percy Dunor stood before the court, was asked, and requested permission to enter documentation into the record. Granted. He presented his ledger, open to the transaction page, with H. Grace entered as the broker for the land sale adjacent to the Pruitt homestead, dated 7 weeks after the fire. He stated the date clearly, stated the buyer clearly, stated the price. Grace's lawyer objected to the relevance. McAllister looked at the objection for exactly as long as it took him to decide he found it unpersuasive and moved on. Walt presented the timeline, the sequence of Continental Mining's offers and Thomas Pruitt's refusals across 6 years, the escalating nature of the offers, the arrival of Grace as a private broker with an offer that exceeded all previous figures, Thomas Pruitt's refusal, the fire 8 days later. He presented it with the flat accuracy of a man who'd been keeping his own records for reasons he'd hoped would never be necessary. Grace's lawyer objected 3 more times. McAllister sustained none of them. Then McAllister looked at the respondent's table. Elias Pruitt stood. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms went what when the thing everyone had come to see was actually happening, and it was bigger in the room than it had been in the anticipation of it. Elias didn't look at the crowd. He looked at McAllister and he looked at Grace, and he did not look at Morrow. He reached into his coat and produced the page he'd written the night before. The same one McAllister had read in his office, and he set it on the table in front of him rather than reading from it. Because he didn't need to read from it, and he spoke. His voice came out rough, slow, the voice of a man relearning the mechanics of a thing he'd set down for 10 months and was now picking back up because the weight of not picking it up had finally exceeded the weight of trying. Every word was chosen. Every word landed in the room with the specific gravity of language that had cost something to produce. He described the night of the fire from the beginning, not from the fire itself. From the 2 hours before it, when he'd heard horses approaching on the South Road, and had stood at the window looking at riders who moved with the particular purpose of men executing a plan rather than men traveling toward a destination. He described what he'd heard through the walls of his family's house. Not everything. The specific things that were germane, the voices, the orders, the names spoken in a tone of authority that belonged to the man giving orders rather than the men carrying them out. And then he looked at Harlan Grace directly. The room held its breath. You stood at the gate, Elias said. Each word separate. A man building something one piece at a time and making sure each piece was load-bearing before he added the next. And you told them to make sure nobody walked away from it. I heard you. I was in the root cellar with my hand over my mouth, and I heard every word you said, and I have been hearing it every night for 10 months. He paused. Let it sit. I know your voice the way I know my father's voice. The way I know the difference between those two things. The silence in the town hall was the kind that had weight. Grace's expression had gone through 3 phases during this, and was now in the 4th, which was the face of a man confronted with the specific accounting he'd believed would never come due, because the only witness had stopped speaking, and Grace had interpreted that silence as the permanent kind. He'd been wrong. Which was the most important thing that had happened in Coldstone in 10 years. One of Grace's hired witnesses stood abruptly. The younger one, the one who'd been shifting in his chair since Percy's testimony. He looked at McAllister, and his voice had the quality of a man jumping from a burning structure and hoping the ground below was softer than it looked. I wanted on the record that I was told this was a straightforward guardianship matter. I was paid to confirm a man's state of residence. Nothing about what I'm hearing today was explained to me when I agreed to appear. He sat down, did not look at Grace. Grace's lawyer leaned close again. Grace listened. His jaw worked once. His hands on the table were flat and still in the way of a man applying deliberate control to things that wanted to move. McAllister let the room settle for exactly 5 seconds. Then, Mr. Grace, the court has received documented evidence of your brokerage role in the land transaction adjacent to the Pruitt property. The court has received testimony regarding your presence at the scene of the incident. that resulted in the deaths of Thomas and Margaret Pruitt and their youngest child. The court has received a written and verbal account from Elias Pruitt, who is demonstrably present and demonstrably communicative, and demonstrably the opposite of incapacitated. He set his pen down with a precision that was its own kind of sentence. The guardianship petition is denied. Furthermore, I am referring the questions raised today regarding the circumstances of the Pruitt fire to the Territorial Marshal's office for formal investigation. He looked at the sheriff standing at the back wall. Mr. Grace is not to leave Coldstone pending the initiation of that investigation. The sheriff moved. Grace's lawyer stood with an objection that died somewhere between his mouth and the room's reception of it. Grace himself sat for one long second with the expression of a man watching a structure he'd spent years building come apart at the seams in front of an audience he'd have preferred not to have. Then he stood very straight, the last performance of a man who'd always led with presentation, and was escorted from the room without the grace his name suggested. Morrow left the gallery before the room finished reacting. She saw him go, noted the direction. North and out, not south toward the saloon or east toward the boarding house. Out of Coldstone, which was the appropriate direction for a man whose employer had just been detained and whose secondary piece of business had been rendered moot by a woman who had more witnesses to her whereabouts than the warrant required. She didn't follow him with her eyes beyond the door. He was a problem that had solved itself, the particular variety that happened when the scaffolding holding it up collapsed under the weight of a different problem's resolution. Around her, the room was doing what rooms did after something significant happened. The specific noise of people releasing tension they'd been holding, turning to their neighbors, beginning the process of converting what they'd witnessed into the story they'd tell about it for the next 20 years. Walt Duggan shaking Percy's hand. The blacksmith saying something to the woman from the boarding house that made her press her lips together and nod as though he'd confirmed something she'd been privately sure of. Elias was still standing at the respondent's table. He had not sat down after speaking. He stood with both hands flat on the table surface, looking at the place where Grace had been sitting, and the expression on his face was not triumph, was not relief, was something more complex than either. The expression of a man who'd carried a specific weight for 10 months and had just set it down and was now discovering that the absence of it had its own kind of difficulty. You got used to weight. Stopping carrying it didn't mean you immediately knew what to do with the hands. Calloway moved to him. The pace of a man who understood that some moments required presence rather than speed. He stood beside Elias at the table and put one hand on the younger man's shoulder and left it there. Elias looked at the hand, then looked at Calloway. Something passed between them that 10 months of shared mornings and quiet dinners and uncrowded silences had built toward without anyone naming it. Your father would have thought that was worth seeing, Calloway said. Rough. Quiet. Just the two of them in it, despite the room's noise all around them. Elias didn't speak, but his right hand came up and covered Calloway's on his shoulder briefly. 1 second. Then he straightened, looked at the room around him with the measured attention of a man beginning, for the first time in a long time, to consider it navigable. Maren stood back and let the moment be what it was. Outside the town hall, as Coldstone's population began its slow dispersal back to the business the morning had interrupted, Frank Lashley from the saloon found Calloway on the steps and extended a hand that Calloway accepted after a moment's visible surprise. Dale Pewitt, who Maren had been told ran bets on various frontier outcomes including the lifespan of Calloway's matrimonial arrangements, caught her eye from across the street and had the specific dignity to look briefly at his boots before tipping his hat. She took that, filed it. People were complicated, and complicated people sometimes got things right eventually, and that was worth acknowledging. Walt Duggan appeared at her elbow with his mule's reins in one hand and a look on his weathered face that was the closest thing to satisfaction she'd seen from him. McAllister will have the marshal's inquiry underway by end of week, he said. Continental Mining's going to distance themselves from Grace publicly within the month. They always do when the legal scaffolding comes down. Makes the next acquisition that much cleaner for them. He looked at her directly. Land stays in Elias's name. Yes, and you, he let the word sit. I'm going up the mountain, she said. That's where I live. Walt's look did something that was the 70-year-old version of a smile. Morrow's gone. Cecily Ward left on the early coach. Grace is going to be occupied with the marshal for the foreseeable future. He picked up the mule's reins with the ease of a man who'd been doing that same motion for 50 years. You might actually have a quiet spring. I'll believe it when it arrives. He laughed, short, genuine. Then walked his mule toward the feed store because he had a business to run and the territory wasn't going to manage itself. They rode back up in the late afternoon. The three of them, the light going long and gold through the pines in the way that only happened in February, when winter was beginning to exhaust itself and the sun was remembering what it was for. The trail was easier going up than it had been in months, the cold having packed the snow into something firmer than the treacherous slush of the previous weeks. Elias rode slightly ahead for the last quarter mile, not because he was rushing, because the mountain was his, and he knew it in a way that showed in the way a horse knew its way to water. The body following knowledge the mind didn't have to supervise. She watched him ride and thought about Thomas Pruitt's 4 sentences and the smile that had told him what he needed to know too late to do anything useful with it. The sun had done something about it instead, 10 months late by the calendar and exactly on time by every other measure. The cabin looked different in the late light. It had been looking different incrementally for weeks, and she hadn't been able to name the accumulation until now. The same walls, the same chimney, the same yard. But the quality of the space around it had changed the way a room changed when it was occupied by people who had stopped guarding themselves inside it. Calloway pulled up beside her at the clearing's edge. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the cabin with its smoke and its lamp glow in the window, which meant the fire had held all day, which meant the stove was still functional, which was useful information about nothing important, and both of them knew it. You could have left when morrow came, he said. Taken the horse. Had 3 hours before anyone on the mountain knew which direction. I know. Could have left when you went down to find Cecily Ward. Kept riding south. I know. He turned and looked at her. The specific look, the one she'd been cataloging since the first night, that kept containing more than the previous inventory had prepared her for. Why didn't you? He said. She looked at the cabin, at the lamp in the window, at the smoke going straight up in the still air because the wind had finally, for one evening, decided to leave them alone. Because going somewhere else would have meant this wasn't home, she said. And it is. She turned and looked at him directly. It became that somewhere in the middle of a 6-day storm, and I didn't have the bandwidth to notice it happening until it was already done. He held her gaze for a long moment. I want to ask you something, he said. The tone different now. Careful in the way of a man who'd thought about this enough that the thinking had worn a groove in him. Not because a judge filed paper in December, because I want to separate from what any paper says. She waited. Marry me, he said it simply. No ornamentation, no framing. The way he said everything that mattered, stripped of everything that didn't. The way that means something, not the arrangement, not the convenience. His jaw worked once. Because I don't want you to leave, and I don't want to be the kind of man who needs a contract to say so. The clearing, the cold, the lamp in the window behind her. She took his hand, the hand that had worked trap lines and carried Elias down a mountain and pressed itself flat against a table when he was trying to hold himself steady, and was now in her hand being held steady by someone else for the first time in a long time. She held it until the answer settled into the space between them without requiring a word. Then she said, 3 weeks. When your best coat doesn't smell like the barn. He looked at the coat, back at her. 2 weeks, he said. 2.5. Done. Elias, who had reached the cabin ahead of them and was dismounting at the rail, looked back at whatever he'd heard in their voices, without hearing the words, and read the situation with the accuracy of a man who'd spent 10 months developing alternative means of understanding what was happening around him. He went inside without comment, but he left the door open. They married on a Thursday, in early March, when the snow on Bear Hollow's lower meadow had begun pulling back from the south-facing slopes, in the tentative way of things that weren't entirely sure the invitation was genuine. The town hall held a gathering that was not the whole town, but was most of it, and the people who came did so, because some stories earned their endings, and this one had done it in the specific visible way of a hearing room in February, where 3 threads of evidence and one man's voice had accomplished what 10 months of silence had been waiting to make possible. Walt Duggan stood as witness. Percy Dunor donated fabric without being asked, which Maren had used to make something that was not a wedding dress so much as a very deliberate garment for a very deliberate occasion. Elias stood between them throughout the ceremony with the particular composure of a man who had decided some time ago, without announcement, that he was going to stay, and had been staying all along, and the ceremony was simply the public version of a private fact. When McAllister pronounced them married in the proper legal sense rather than the convenience sense, Elias reached out and took both their hands simultaneously for exactly the length of time it took to make the point. Frank Lashley poured drinks afterward, milk for Elias, which Frank offered without making it into anything, and Elias took it the same way, and the exchange was its own kind of belonging. Spring arrived on Bear Hollow the way it always arrived at elevation, later than in the valley, less convinced it was staying, with a light that was thin and tentative, and then without announcement became the real thing. The south meadow cleared first, then the north trail, then the clearing around the cabin, the snow retreating in patches that revealed dark earth underneath, the particular dark of soil that hadn't seen sun since November and was now remembering what it was for. Elias built a garden bed along the south wall, not asked, not discussed in advance. He arrived one morning with tools and began turning soil, and Calloway looked out the window at this and said nothing for a long moment and then went out to help without being asked in return. "What are we planting?" Calloway said. Elias considered the soil. "Beans," he said, which was technically his first public joke, delivered at approximately the same volume as his father's land management decisions and with the same absence of performance. Calloway looked at the soil, back at Elias. "What else?" "Something that for a moment. Not the old quiet, a different kind. My mother grew them by the front door, whatever kind those were." "We'll find out," Calloway said. Maren heard this through the open window while she was doing something she'd been doing for 2 weeks and sus not saying anything about because she hadn't been sure yet, hadn't wanted to say the thing until the thing was certain enough to hold the weight of being said aloud. She stood at the kitchen window with her hand against the wall and listened to them, working in the garden, and let the certainty finish arriving. That evening she came out to where Calloway was sitting on the porch, watching Elias check the perimeter the way he still checked it every evening, the old habit worn into something that was less about fear now, and more about knowing the ground. She sat beside him, and took his hand and placed it against her, held it there. He went completely still, then he looked at her, and she watched the thing that moved across his face, all of it at once, every one of the things a man felt when the life he'd stopped believing he was going to have turned out to be the life he was currently living. And the evidence was in his hand, and she didn't try to name any of it or smooth any of it and just let him have it. He laughed. It came out rough and unpracticed and entirely genuine. The laugh of a man who hadn't used it enough to have kept it in good working order. And she thought she could probably listen to that laugh for the next 40 years and not find it less than it was right now. "When?" he said. "September, give or take." He looked at the clearing, at Elias coming back from the tree line with the measured pace of a man who'd confirmed what he needed to confirm, at the cabin behind them and the garden beside it, and the mountain above all of it doing what mountains did, enduring, offering no reassurance and requiring none. 26 women climbed this mountain, he said quietly. Not one of them stayed past 9 days. He looked at her. "You built something out of nothing." "We built it," she said. "All 3 of us, and soon 4. Elias reached the porch steps and looked between their faces with the accuracy that had been his particular intelligence since long before she'd arrived. She looked at him directly. "You're going to have someone to look out for come September," she said. He processed this, the full sequence of it, what it meant, what it would require, what it would change, and what it wouldn't. Then he nodded once, the decisive single nod of a man who'd made a decision and was implementing it immediately. "I'll teach them the perimeter," he said. Calloway looked at her, she looked at him, because that was Elias Pruitt in one sentence, in all the ways it mattered, the man who'd survived the unsurvivable, and come out the other side with his particular intelligence intact, and his hands steady and a specific understanding of what it meant to know your ground, that you checked it not because you were afraid, but because you loved what you were checking it for. She leaned back against the wall of the cabin that was no longer a fortress by anyone's definition, that had become slowly and entirely without planning the kind of home that was built not from what you started with but from what you chose to stay for, and let the evening come in over Bear Hollow, and didn't count the minutes, and didn't calculate the exits, and didn't listen for anything that wasn't there. Just this. Just the three of them on a porch in early spring, with the ground coming back to life below them, and the mountain keeping its own counsel above, and the garden they'd plant tomorrow waiting in turned dark earth along the south wall, like a promise nobody had needed to make out loud because they'd all already made it, every morning, for the last 3 months, just by being there when the other two woke up, which she was beginning to understand was the whole of what any of it ever was.